30 years in the garden, hundreds of plants, dozens of redesigns, more trial and error than I'd ever admit out loud. And still, these 9 decisions stand out. 9 perennials I planted with full confidence and later wished I had never brought home. Not because they failed to grow, that would have been easier. They succeeded, just not in the way the label promised, not in the way the catalogue showed, not in the way I imagined when I was standing in the garden centre in April thinking, this will fix that empty spot. So I'm going to walk you through them, one by one, not to scare you away from planting, but to save you from repeating the exact same mistakes. Because every one of these plants looks good on the tag, every one of them sells fast, and every one of them comes with something the label doesn't fully explain. Number 9 is the one that teaches patience the hard way. Number 1 is the one that looks harmless until it's too late. Let's start. Number 9, foxglove. Tall, dramatic, almost architectural. You see those spires in photos, 5-6 feet of blooms stacked vertically, and it feels like instant impact. And technically, it delivers, just not on your timeline. Foxglove is sold as a perennial, the tag says it clearly, but in most conditions it behaves as a biennial, which means year 1, nothing but leaves. Year 2, the flowers you actually bought it for, and then it's gone. That's the part most people don't plan for. You plant it expecting continuity, but what you actually get is a cycle. Plant, wait, bloom, replace. And if you want it to stay in your garden long term, you're not maintaining a plant, you're managing a population, letting it self-seed, waiting for new plants to mature, accepting that the display will always be shifting, sometimes full, sometimes empty. That's not necessarily a problem, but it's not what most people think they're buying. Number 8, coral bells, the hybrid varieties. This is where appearance becomes misleading because coral bells look perfect in the pot. Deep colors, clean foliage, compact shape. Everything about them feels refined. And for the first year or two, they perform exactly that way. Then something subtle starts to happen. The crown, the central base of the plant, begins to rise. Not dramatically, just slightly. Each year it lifts a little more out of the soil, until eventually the roots are partially exposed. And once that happens, the plant becomes vulnerable. Temperature swings, freeze and thaw cycles, drying, and slowly the plant declines. Not all at once, gradually, which makes it easy to miss until it's already happening. And by the time you notice, it's usually too late to correct. The mistake here isn't planting coral bells. It's assuming all varieties behave the same. The species types stay stable. The heavily bred hybrids often don't, and that difference isn't always obvious when you're buying them. Number 7, Russian sage, the older varieties. This is one of those plants that looks better every year, until it doesn't. Year 1, it establishes. Year 2, it fills out. Year 3, it looks like it's reaching its full potential. And then the center starts to thin, the growth moves outward, the middle opens, and what was once a full, airy mound becomes a ring, a hollow shape that no amount of trimming really fixes. You can cut it back, you can try to reshape it, but the growth pattern is already set. This isn't neglect, it's structure. Older varieties were never bred to hold a tight form long term. Newer ones are. And that's the difference most people don't realize when they pick up the cheaper, unnamed version at the nursery. You save a little up front and lose the shape you wanted a few seasons later. Number 6, hollyhocks. Another plant that sells on height and nostalgia. Tall spires, classic look, cottage garden feel. But the reality is almost identical to foxglove. It behaves like a biennial, not a long-term perennial, which means you're always in a cycle of replanting or reseeding. And then there's the second issue, disease. Hollyhock rust shows up almost every season in many climates. It starts as small spots on the leaves, then spreads. And by mid to late season, the lower half of the plant often looks damaged, discolored, falling apart. So even when the flowers are still doing their job, the plant itself starts to lose its visual appeal. And suddenly, that tall, dramatic feature becomes something you're trying to hide behind other plants. Number 5, bee balm, the wrong varieties. This one is less about the plant and more about the selection, because bee balm can be excellent, strong blooms, pollinator magnet, good height, but only if you choose the right variety. Older types are highly susceptible to powdery mildew, and once it appears, it spreads quickly. Leaves turn dull, then coated, then damaged. By late season, the plant can look like it's been dusted in chalk. And at that point, the flowers don't matter, because the foliage is what carries the plant visually. So the mistake here isn't planting bee balm. It's planting unnamed or older varieties without checking resistance, because visually, they all look similar when you buy them. The difference only shows up later. Number 4, obedient plant. This is where naming becomes misleading. The name suggests control, order, something that behaves. But that name refers to the flowers, not the plant itself. Underground, it spreads, not slowly, not politely, but aggressively. And over time, what starts as a single plant becomes a patch, then a larger patch, then something that begins appearing in places you didn't intend, between other plants, across beds, beyond its original space. And at that point, removal becomes difficult. Because it doesn't just sit in one place, it connects, through roots, through spread. So pulling one section doesn't solve the problem. It just reveals how far it's already gone. Now pause for a second, because every plant so far shares a pattern. They promise something simple, height, color, ease, and they deliver that initially. But over time, the hidden behavior shows up. Short lifespan, structural issues, disease, spread. And that's what turns a good decision into a regret. Part 2 is where this shifts even further, because the next plants don't just disappoint, they create problems that take time to fix, and in some cases, can't be fully undone. Part 2 is where the pattern changes. Up to this point, the regrets were manageable, short-lived plants, structural issues, disease problems you could work around or replace. Annoying, yes, but fixable. Now we move into a different category, plants that don't just disappoint over time, they take control of space in ways you didn't expect. Plants that change the layout of your garden without asking, and once they're established, removing them isn't a quick correction. It becomes a project. Number 3, fancy echinacea hybrids. This one looks like progress. Brighter colors, double blooms, unique shapes. Everything about these hybrids feels like an upgrade from the standard coneflower, and in the first season, they often are. The blooms are bold, the colors stand out, they look like something new. But that first impression doesn't last. Many of these heavily bred hybrids sacrifice longevity for appearance. The root systems are weaker, the plants don't anchor as deeply, and over a few seasons, they begin to decline. Not all at once, but noticeably. Fewer stems, smaller blooms, then gaps where plants used to be. And suddenly, what was supposed to be a long-term perennial becomes something you're replacing every couple of years. The frustrating part is that right next to them, the basic species version, simpler, less dramatic, keeps going. Year after year, same spot, same performance, no decline. So the mistake here isn't planting echinacea, it's choosing the version that looks best on the tag instead of the one that lasts in the soil. Number 2, plume poppy. This is where things stop being subtle. Plume poppy doesn't just grow, it expands, and it doesn't ask permission. When you plant it, it looks like a statement plant. Large leaves, strong presence, something that fills vertical space quickly. And at first, that's exactly what it does. But below the surface, something else is happening. The roots begin to travel, not inches, feet, and not just in one direction, every direction. So what starts as a single plant becomes multiple points of growth. then more, then areas you never intended. It shows up in the lawn, in nearby beds, between other plants. And because it spreads underground, removing it becomes complicated. You can't just pull it out, you have to trace it, find where it's connected, remove entire sections of root. And even then, if a small piece remains, it returns. This is not a plant you casually remove on a weekend. This is something that changes how you manage the entire area. And the real issue? None of that is obvious when you buy it. It looks contained, controlled, like something that will stay where you put it. It doesn't. And that's where the regret comes from. Now, before we get to number one, take a second and look at the pattern again. These plants weren't chosen randomly. They were chosen because they look good, because they promise impact, because they seem like solutions. And that's exactly why they sell. But what they don't show you is time. What happens after year one, after year two, after the plant has settled in and started behaving the way it naturally does? That's the part most gardeners learn too late, because by the time you see it, you're already dealing with it. Now, number one, and this is where the mistake feels different, because this plant doesn't look aggressive, it doesn't look problematic, it looks harmless, familiar, even comforting. Number one, lily of the valley. This is the plant that draws you in emotionally. Small white flowers, strong fragrance, shade tolerance. Everything about it feels like a perfect addition to a quiet corner of the garden. And for the first few seasons, it behaves exactly that way. It fills in gently, adds softness, creates that calm, shaded look people are trying to achieve. But underneath, it's spreading. Slowly at first, then steadily, then aggressively, through rhizomes that move below the surface. And once it establishes, it doesn't stop. It moves under pathways, into other beds, through areas you thought were separate. And removing it becomes one of the most frustrating tasks in the garden, because the roots are fine, thread-like, difficult to fully extract, and any piece left behind can regrow. So what started as a small patch becomes a permanent presence, one that expands every year. And that would already be enough to make it a problem. But there's something else. Toxicity. Every part of the plant contains compounds that can be harmful if ingested. Pets, children, even accidental contact can become an issue depending on the situation. So now the plant isn't just spreading, it's spreading something you have to be aware of constantly. And that changes how you interact with that part of your garden. Now step back, because this is where everything connects. Foxglove didn't last. Coral bells didn't stay stable. Russian sage lost its shape. Hollyhocks declined. Bee balm developed disease. Obedient plants spread more than expected. Echinacea hybrids didn't persist. Plume poppy took over. Lily of the valley became permanent. Different problems, same pattern. Expectation versus behavior. And that's the real lesson. Because none of these plants are inherently bad. They're just misunderstood, or misrepresented, or chosen without the full picture. So the question changes. It's no longer, is this plant good? It becomes, does this plant behave the way I expect it to over time? Because that's what determines whether something becomes a success or a regret. Now imagine your garden 5 years from now. Not this season, not next season, 5 years. Which plants are still there? Which ones have expanded beyond where you wanted them? Which ones have faded out? Which ones are still doing exactly what you planted them for? That's the perspective that changes everything. Because when you start thinking long-term, the decisions shift. You stop choosing based on appearance alone. You start choosing based on behavior, stability, growth pattern, longevity. And that's when mistakes become less frequent. Not because you avoid trying new plants, but because you understand what those plants will actually do once they settle in. Part 3 is where this becomes practical, because knowing what to avoid is only half the answer. The real question is, what should you do differently? And how do you choose plants that won't turn into the next regret? Part 3 is where the shift happens, because at this point you've seen the pattern. It wasn't bad luck, it wasn't poor care, it was mismatch between what the plant does and what you expected it to do. So the question now becomes practical. How do you stop repeating that cycle? How do you choose plants that don't turn into the next problem 3 years from now? Because avoiding 9 mistakes is useful, but building a system that prevents the 10th, that's what actually changes your garden. Start with lifespan. This is the detail almost nobody checks. Is the plant actually perennial in your climate, or just labeled that way? Does it return reliably, or does it behave like a biennial or short-lived plant? Because there's a difference between comes back sometimes and builds over time. And if you're designing a space that's meant to improve each year, that difference matters. Before you buy, look past the label. Check how long the plant typically persists. Not in perfect conditions, in real ones, because a plant that lasts 2 or 3 seasons isn't necessarily a bad choice, but it is a different type of commitment. And if you don't recognize that up front, it becomes a replacement cycle you didn't plan for. Now look at growth habit. This is where most regrets begin. Not because the plant grew poorly, but because it grew exactly the way it was designed to. Spreading plants, clumping plants, running plants, self-seeding plants. Each one behaves differently, and each one needs a different kind of space. If you put a spreading plant into a tight, controlled bed, it won't stay contained. If you put a slow clumper into a large, open space, it may never fill it the way you expect. So instead of asking, how big does this plant get? Ask something more precise. How does this plant move? Does it expand outward slowly? Does it send runners underground? Does it stay in place and build density? Because movement determines maintenance, and maintenance determines whether something feels manageable or overwhelming. Next, structure. Not how it looks in year 1, how it holds itself in year 3, 5, 10. Does it keep a defined shape? Does it split? Does it open in the center? Does it collapse outward? These are not minor details. They're built into the plant's genetics, and once that pattern starts, it doesn't reverse. So when you choose a plant, you're not just choosing the current form, you're choosing its future form, and that's the version you'll live with the longest. Now consider resistance, disease, pests, environmental stress. Some plants handle these quietly, others struggle every season, and the difference isn't always visible when you buy them. A plant can look perfect in spring and decline every summer. Not because you did something wrong, but because it wasn't built for those conditions. So instead of asking, does this plant grow well here? Ask, how does it respond under stress? Because that's what determines whether it becomes reliable or frustrating. Now step back again, because all of this leads to a simple shift. You stop choosing plants based on how they look in the moment, and you start choosing based on how they behave over time. That one change removes most of the regret. Now let's make this even more practical. Imagine you're standing in a garden center, looking at a plant you've never grown before. The tag shows flowers, height, sun requirements, basic information. But that's not enough. So you ask a different set of questions. Will this plant still be here in 5 years? Will it stay where I plant it? Will it keep its shape? Will it require constant correction? Will it spread into areas I don't want it to? Those questions don't appear on the tag, but they determine the outcome. And once you start asking them, your choices begin to change. Now here's something else that matters. Named varieties, not just the species, the specific cultivar. Because within the same plant type, behavior can vary dramatically. Some varieties are bred for compact growth, others for disease resistance, others for longer lifespan. And if you don't know which one you're buying, you're leaving that outcome to chance. So when you see a plant without a clear variety name, pause, because that's often where inconsistency comes from. The difference between success and regret is sometimes just that one detail. Now let's talk about scale, because this is where even experienced gardeners misjudge. A plant might look reasonable in a 1-gallon pot, contained, proportional, but that pot doesn't represent its mature footprint. It represents a starting point, and if you underestimate that growth, the plant eventually outgrows the space you gave it, which leads to crowding, competition, or removal. So instead of imagining the plant as it is, picture it fully grown. Then decide if it still fits. Because once it reaches that size, it's not adjusting to your space, you're adjusting to it. Now there's one more layer, time. Because some plants improve with time. They become fuller, stronger, more reliable. Others peak early and decline. And if you fill your garden with plants that peak in year 1 or 2, you're constantly replacing instead of building. But if you choose plants that improve, the garden compounds. It becomes easier, more stable, more complete with each season. And that's the long-term difference. Now bring everything together: lifespan, growth habit, structure, resistance, variety, scale, time. These are the factors that determine whether a plant becomes part of your garden or a problem in it. And none of them are obvious at first glance, which is why mistakes happen. Not because you chose poorly, but because you didn't have the full picture. Now imagine approaching your next planting with this mindset. You're not just filling space, you're building something that has to hold up over time. Every plant has a role, every placement has a reason, every choice considers not just what it looks like today, but what it will become. That's the shift from planting to designing. And once you make that shift, regrets become rare. Not impossible, but rare. Because you're no longer reacting to problems, you're preventing them. So now think about your own garden. Which plant has caused the most frustration over time? Not the one that died, the one that stayed, but behaved differently than you expected. That's the one that teaches the most. Drop a comment and tell me which perennial you regret planting and what it actually did once it settled in. Because those experiences are what help everyone make better decisions the next time. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.